In the summer of 2028, the town of Covenant, Nebraska ran out of water. Or rather, 314 of its 315 registered wells ran dry. The one that didn't belonged to a man named Elias Thorne, and it was, according to the state's Natural Resources District, illegal. It wasn't just a little illegal. It was 162 feet deeper than the law allowed, a flagrant violation of NRD Mandate 11B, a rule designed with computer models and satellite data to ensure the long-term viability of the Ogallala Aquifer. The viability of the aquifer was, at that moment, a moot point. For the 2,148 residents of Covenant and the surrounding farms that covered 80,000 acres of prime corn country, the only viable water in a 50-mile radius was bubbling up from Elias Thorne's very deep, very illegal well. The story of how this came to be isn't about a drought. It's about two different ways of understanding the world, one measured in gigabytes and the other in generations. Let me tell you about the water, because that's where it starts. The Ogallala Aquifer is not a lake. It is not a river. It is a sprawling, subterranean sea of gravel and sand, saturated with water that fell as rain during the last ice age 10,000 years ago. It sprawls under 174,000 square miles of 8 states, from South Dakota to Texas. It holds more water than Lake Huron. For a century, it had been the lifeblood of the high plains, turning a semi-arid grassland into the breadbasket of the world. By the early 21st century, that ancient water was being pumped out 8 times faster than it was being replenished by rainfall. In parts of Kansas and Texas, the water was simply gone. In Nebraska, which sat atop the deepest and thickest part of the formation, the decline was slower, but no less inexorable. The water table under Covenant, which had been 80 feet below the surface in 1950, was 190 feet below the surface in 2020. The change was too slow to panic anyone, but it was fast enough to create committees, and committees create regulations. The Loup Platte Natural Resources District was one of 23 such entities in Nebraska, tasked with the impossible job of managing a dwindling resource that everyone believed was their birthright. In 2021, armed with a new decade of hydrological surveys and a $1.2 million federal grant, the NRD board passed Mandate 11B. It was a comprehensive water management plan, full of sensible, data-driven rules. It stipulated flow meter requirements, irrigation scheduling based on evapotranspiration rates, and, most contentiously, a maximum allowable depth, or MAD, for all new and re-drilled wells in the district. For the substrata beneath Covenant, that depth was set at 250 feet. The logic, printed in a glossy brochure distributed at the county fair, was clear. Restricting wells to the upper portion of the aquifer would prevent the most powerful deep well pumps from creating cones of depression, localized drawdowns that could prematurely dry up shallower, neighboring wells. It was a policy of shared sacrifice for the common good. It was scientific. It was fair. And it was the reason a man named Marcus Rhodes drove his government-issue Ford F-150 down Elias Thorne's gravel driveway on a bright Tuesday morning in May of 2022. Marcus Rhodes was 32 years old. He had a master's degree in hydrogeology from the University of Nebraska and a profound faith in data. He was not an antagonist. He was a believer. He believed that nature was a complex system that could be understood, modeled, and managed for optimal outcomes. He was trim, wore moisture-wicking polo shirts, and carried a tablet that held more information about the ground beneath his feet than any human had ever possessed. He was here because the NRD's records showed that the Thorne farm, Section 14, Township 10 North, Range 6 West, had a registered well drilled in 1958 to a depth of 412 feet. Under the new mandate, it was now officially non-compliant. The well had to be retrofitted. A new, shorter casing would have to be installed, effectively raising the well's floor to the 250-foot limit. He found Elias Thorne, who was 78 years old, sitting on the porch of the same white farmhouse his grandfather had built in 1888. Elias was a widower, a father of one, a grandfather of one. He had farmed this same 640-acre section of land for 57 years. He was known for three things: growing a strain of open-pollinated white corn that no one else bothered with, never missing a Sunday service at the Covenant Lutheran Church, and a stubbornness that the charitable called principled and the uncharitable called ornery. He was wearing faded denim overalls over a gray work shirt, and his hands, resting on his knees, looked like gnarled pieces of oak. They were hands that had fixed tractors, delivered calves, and dug post holes in the same soil for more than half a century. Marcus Rhodes began with a friendly, practiced ease. He talked about the drought in California, the importance of conservation, the NRD's commitment to preserving the farming way of life for future generations. He laid out the mandate, the science behind it, the subsidies available for the retrofitting. He showed Elias charts on his tablet, elegant color-coded graphics displaying the aquifer's decline. Red meant danger. A lot of the map was red. Elias listened without interrupting. He watched Marcus's finger swipe across the glossy screen. When the young man was finished, Elias was quiet for a long moment. He tapped his right thumb against his right forefinger, a slow, steady rhythm. Finally, he spoke. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Where is your family from, Mr. Rhodes?" Marcus was taken aback. Omaha. My dad was a lawyer." Elias nodded slowly. "I see." He looked out across his fields, where the new shoots of his white corn were just beginning to poke through the dark soil. "My grandfather, Samuel Thorne, he came here from Ohio in 1882. He broke this sod with a team of mules. He dug his first well by hand, 110 feet with a spade and a bucket. Took him a whole summer. He hit water, and he built this house. That's a fantastic story, Mr. Thorne. A real piece of history. The NRD wants to make sure your great-grandchildren can tell stories like that." Elias's eyes, pale blue and webbed with wrinkles, shifted back to Marcus. "My father, Thomas Thorne, he was here for the Dust Bowl. You see that windbreak of cedars at the edge of the property? He planted every one of them. He watched the creek run dry for 7 years straight. He watched neighbors pack up and leave, their topsoil blowing away behind them. In 38, he decided the hand-dug well wasn't enough. He hired a man with a drilling rig, a new invention. They went deeper." Marcus consulted his tablet. The record shows a re-drilling in 1938 to 220 feet. That was a good depth for the time. "It was," Elias agreed. "But my father taught me something. He said, the easy water is a liar. He meant the water that's right there at the top. It's the first to show up in a wet year, and it's the first to leave in a dry one. It's fickle." He kept a ledger. Elias stood up, his joints creaking, and went inside. He returned with a thick, leather-bound book. The cover was worn smooth, and the pages were yellowed and brittle. He opened it on a small table between them, The pages were filled with neat, cursive script, dates, rainfall totals in inches, static water levels in the well, crop yields. It was a 90-year-long, handwritten conversation with this specific piece of land. "Here," Elias said, pointing a calloused finger at a page from 1954. A wet decade. Water level was up to 90 feet. Everyone was putting in shallow wells, getting cheap irrigation. But my father wrote here. He squinted, reading the faded ink. "The land has a short memory, but the sky has a long one. The dry will return." He told me the deep water, the old water, is different. It's slow. It doesn't panic. It's the farm's memory. So in 1958, when he had a good year, he had the well drilled again. He told the man not to stop until he hit the Brule Formation. Marcus frowned. The Brule Formation? That's a layer of clay and siltstone. It's considered the effective bottom of the high-yield zone. "It is," Elias said. "But just below it, there's a seam of gravel, an old river channel from before the ice. It's not on your maps, but it's there. My father found it. It's not much, but it's steady. He went to 412 feet, cost him almost everything he had. His neighbors said he was a fool, said he was trying to pump water from China. Then the drought of the 70s came. Their wells sputtered. Ours didn't." "Mr. Thorne, I respect your family history, I truly do. But the science is clear." Marcus swiped his screen, bringing up a 3D model of the aquifer. "We have ground-penetrating radar, satellite gravimetry. We know what's down there. And individual deep wells like yours create a disproportionate drawdown. The model shows that in a moderate drought scenario, your well could impact your neighbors, Dale Harding to the west, the Jensen family to the south. This mandate is about protecting everyone. It's about equity." Elias looked at the glowing screen, at the neat, colored layers of simulated Earth. "Your model," he said softly. "It knows a lot of things. But does it know the difference between the water that remembers the ice and the water that only remembers last spring's rain?" Marcus sighed. It was a conversation he'd had before with men like Thorne. They were a dying breed, men who trusted their gut and their grandfather's stories over petabytes of data. He felt a pang of sympathy, but his job was to enforce the rules. The rules were for the greater good. "The mandate is the mandate, Mr. Thorne. We can grant you a 90-day extension, but after that, you'll need to have the well retrofitted. If you don't, we'll have to start issuing fines. $500 a month." Elias Thorne closed the old ledger. He looked at Marcus Rhodes, not with anger, but with a kind of weary sorrow. "You tell your committee," he said, "that my father left me this land. And he left me that well. He didn't leave it to me so I could let a map on a glass screen tell me when to be thirsty." The conversation was over. Marcus Rhodes drove away with a sense of frustration. He logged the visit in his report. "Farmer is recalcitrant, relies on anecdotal family history, proceeding to notification phase." He was doing the right thing. He was saving the community from itself. The 90 days passed. Elias Thorne did not retrofit his well. The first notice of fine arrived in the mail on September 1st, 2022. It was for $500, payable to the Loup Platte NRD. Elias wrote a check from the farm's account and mailed it back. He did the same thing in October and November, and every month for the next 5.5 years. Let me tell you about the community. News travels fast in a place like Covenant. Everyone knew about Elias Thorne's fight with the NRD. At the grain co-op, at the church potluck, at the Friday night football games. It was a topic of conversation. The initial sentiment was a mix of sympathy and head shaking. Old Man Thorne, stubborn as a mule. But as time went on, and as the NRD rolled out its other programs, sentiment began to shift. The district offered generous cost-sharing programs for farmers who upgraded to high-efficiency pivot irrigation systems. They provided free consultations on soil moisture monitoring. The farmers who complied, who drilled new wells to exactly 250 feet and installed the latest pumps, saw their energy bills go down. They were part of a modern, sustainable system. They were doing the right thing. Dale Harding, whose farm bordered Elias's to the west, tried to talk to him one afternoon over the fence. Dale was 55, a practical man who farmed 2,000 acres of corn and soybeans. He had just installed 2 new Vittel Corcoran VFD8 pumps with telemetry feedback at a cost of $44,000, half of it covered by an NRD grant. "Elias," he said, wiping sweat from his brow, "I just don't get it. You've paid over $20,000 in fines by now. You could have retrofitted that well 10 times over. It's just pride, ain't it?" Elias was pulling weeds from his garden, a patch of earth where he grew tomatoes and the white corn his family had saved for a century. He straightened up slowly. "It's not pride, Dale. It's memory. You were here in 2002. Your well started pumping sand, didn't it?" Dale shifted his weight. "Yeah, well, that was a bad year." "It was a dry year," Elias corrected. "Not a bad one. There's a difference. A bad year is when you forget what a dry one feels like." Dale just shook his head and walked back to his brand-new Wi-Fi-enabled tractor. He liked Elias, but the old man was living in the past. The future was in efficiency, in data, in management. Elias's grandson, Leo, felt the shift most acutely. Leo was 22, studying agricultural economics at the university. When he came home to help with the harvest, he felt the sideways glances. He heard the whispers. His grandfather was the town crank, the old man fighting progress. It was embarrassing. "Grandpa," he argued one evening at the kitchen table, the same table Samuel Thorne had built from cottonwood trees. "You're paying $6,000 a year just to make a point. The farm's margins are already tight. It's not sustainable." Elias was cleaning seeds from his white corn, selecting the best kernels for next year's planting. He rolled a single perfect kernel between his thumb and forefinger. "What's not sustainable," he asked without looking up, "is a system that has to have a committee meeting to decide if it's thirsty. What's not sustainable is a plan for 50 years that ignores the lessons of the last 100. But the data is a snapshot, Leo. The ledger is a river." Leo threw his hands up in frustration. He loved his grandfather, but it was like talking to a stone. He resolved to take over the farm's books, to find a way to offset the fines his grandfather insisted on paying, month after month, year after year. The total reached $30,000. Elias never wavered. He paid the fines, he tended his corn, and he listened to the slow, deep thrum of his well pump, drawing water from a place the maps had forgotten. Then came 2028. It didn't start as a drought. It started as a dry spring. The April showers never came. May was hot and windy. By June, the Little Blue River, which usually ran swift and muddy, had shrunk to a series of stagnant pools. The NRD issued its first water advisory, asking residents to voluntarily reduce lawn watering. By July, the advisory became mandatory. Farmers were restricted to irrigating 3 days a week. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high and deep green, was stunted and pale. Its leaves curled in on themselves during the day, a sign of severe moisture stress. The heat was relentless. For 18 straight days in July, the temperature topped 100 degrees. The sky was a hazy, bleached-out blue. In the first week of August, Dale Harding's well began to sputter. It would pump for 10 minutes, then the flow would thin, turn gritty with sand, and stop. The pump's sensor, designed to prevent it from running dry, would shut it off. He called the well drilling company. They told him the waiting list was 18 months long. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar feeling in a place built on abundance, began to set in. Within a week, it was the same story all over the county. The Jensen family's well went dry. The co-op's massive well, which supplied the town, saw its pressure drop by half. The new, efficient, 250-foot deep wells, the very wells designed to save the aquifer, were all drawing from the same shallow, overworked layer. And that layer was failing. The easy water, the fickle water, was gone. It had lied. The Loup Platte NRD called an emergency public meeting. It was held on the evening of August 14th in the Covenant High School gymnasium. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax and fear. More than 500 people packed the bleachers. Farmers in dusty caps, townspeople in shorts and t-shirts, the mayor, the fire chief. They were all there. They were scared. Their crops were dying. Their taps were running dry. They wanted answers. The man sent to provide those answers was Marcus Rhodes. He stood at a podium in the middle of the basketball court. He was 38 now. He had a few gray hairs at his temples. The confident, easy smile was gone. He looked tired. He looked like a man whose models had failed him. He began by presenting the grim facts. Rainfall was at 12% of the historical average. The aquifer's static water level had dropped 28 feet since May, an unprecedented decline. He showed them the charts on a large projection screen. The maps that had once been a reassuring mix of blue and green were now a terrifying, uniform red. Then he got to the well-by-well status report. It was the reason everyone was there. He had a printout, a list of every registered well in the district. He started reading from it, his voice amplified by the PA system, echoing in the tense silence of the gym. Harding, Dale, Section 14. Registered depth, 245 feet. Static water level as of 8 a.m. this morning, undetectable. A low groan went through the crowd. Dale Harding stared at the floor, his face grim. Jensen, Maria, Section 15. Registered depth, 250 feet. Static water level, undetectable. Schmidt, Robert, Section 12. Registered depth, 248 feet. Static water level, undetectable. He went on, name after name, a litany of ruin. The story was the same. The wells drilled to the legal limit, the wells of the compliant, the responsible, the modern farmers, were all dry. The room grew hotter, the silence heavier. With each name, the failure of the system, the failure of the plan, became more absolute. Then he got to the end of the list for Section 14. He paused. He looked down at the paper in his hands, then looked up at the crowd. His eyes found Elias Thorne, who was sitting in the front row of the bleachers, his grandson Leo beside him. Elias hadn't said a word. He was just watching, his hands resting on his knees. "Thorne, Elias," Marcus said, his voice dropping slightly. "Section 14. Registered depth, 412 feet. He paused again, and in that pause the entire gym seemed to hold its breath. "Static water level, as of 8 a.m. this morning, 380 feet. The number hung in the air. It wasn't a number. It was a verdict. It was the sound of a century of memory pushing back against a decade of theory. It meant that while the top 250 feet of the aquifer were a dust bowl, the deep, forgotten channel his father had found was still there. Slow, steady, unpanicked. For a full 5 seconds there was absolute silence. No one understood the numbers, but they understood the difference. Undetectable. 380 feet. Then Dale Harding, who was sitting 2 rows behind Elias, slowly stood up. He turned and looked at the old man. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Then the man next to him stood up and turned, and the one next to him. A slow, silent wave rippled through the bleachers as hundreds of people turned their chairs, their bodies, their attention away from the man at the podium with his failed maps, and toward the old farmer in the front row with his illegal well. It wasn't a cheer. It was something quieter, more profound. It was the sound of a community realizing it had been listening to the wrong story. The climax of the story was not that moment in the gym. It came the next morning. At 6 a.m., the first truck pulled into Elias Thorne's driveway. It was a water tanker from the Covenant Volunteer Fire Department. The fire chief, a man who had voted in favor of the NRD Mandate, got out and walked up to the porch where Elias was sitting. He took off his cap. "Elias," he said, "we're out. The town reserve is empty. Can you help?" Elias nodded once. Leo, who had stood by his grandfather's side all night, wordlessly uncoiled a heavy-duty hose and connected it to a spigot on the wellhead. He dropped the other end into the tanker. Elias flipped the switch on the pump. The motor, a 30-horsepower electric motor from the 1950s, hummed to life. And water, clear, cold, life-giving water, began to flow. By 8 a.m., there was a line of trucks down his driveway and out onto the county road. The municipal water tanker, Dale Harding's sprayer rig converted to a water hauler. The Jensen family's milk truck emptied and cleaned. 17 vehicles in all, waiting their turn. Leo managed the hose. Elias sat on the porch, the old leather ledger open on his lap, not reading it, just holding it. He watched as the water his father had searched for, the water he had paid $35,400 in fines to protect, filled his neighbors' empty tanks. He wasn't charging them. When the fire chief asked what the town owed him, Elias just shook his head. "The water isn't mine," he said. "It belongs to the dry times." For the next 6 weeks, until a hurricane remnant finally drifted up from the Gulf and broke the drought, Elias Thorne's well was the beating heart of Covenant, Nebraska. It filled the town's water tower. It saved what was left of the corn crop. It kept cattle alive. Every day, Marcus Rhodes would drive out in his NRD truck, not to issue a citation, but to take the official measurement of the water level. He and Elias never spoke of the fines, or the mandate, or the meeting. Marcus would do his test, write the number on a clipboard, and look at Elias. "It's holding steady," he'd say, a note of wonder in his voice. Elias would just nod. "It's old water," he'd reply. "It knows how to wait." One day, in the final week of the drought, Marcus lingered after the test. He stood by his truck, turning his hat over in his hands. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "our models were wrong. The data we had on the upper strata was accurate, but we discounted the deep formations. We treated the aquifer as a single, homogeneous unit. We didn't account for channels like yours. We saw your well as a threat to the system, but it turns out it was the system's only insurance policy." Elias looked at the young man who had tried to force him to cripple his own farm. He saw no triumph in the man's admission, only the quiet exhaustion of someone who had been humbled by a force larger than his own understanding. "It wasn't your model that was wrong," Elias said. "It was your memory. You tried to predict the future without reading the past. Not the past from a textbook. The past that's written right here in the ground. You just have to be quiet enough to read it." The aftermath came slowly, like the rain that finally fell in late September. The NRD officially rescinded Mandate 11B. They launched a new multi-year study of the aquifer's deep geology, a project they informally called the Thorne Initiative. They hired a team of geologists to work with old-timers, to collect oral histories and family records, to integrate the scribbled notes in old ledgers with the data from their satellites. Marcus Rhodes was put in charge of the project. It was a different kind of science, one that balanced confidence with humility. The town of Covenant recovered. The farmers who had lost their crops had a hard year, but they survived. Many of them, including Dale Harding, spent the money to drill deeper wells, seeking out the deep, slow water that Elias had trusted. They did it with a new understanding, a respect for the hidden complexities of the world beneath their feet. Elias Thorne passed away in the spring of 2031 at the age of 87. He died in the same house his grandfather had built. His funeral was the largest Covenant had ever seen. The whole town came to the Lutheran church to pay their respects to the stubborn old man who had saved them. Leo took over the farm. The first thing he did was frame the final notice of fine from the NRD and hang it on the wall in the farm office. Below it, he placed the old leather ledger, opened to the page from 1958, where his grandfather, Thomas Thorne, had recorded the final depth of the new well, 412 feet, and written a single sentence beside it: "For the dry years." The world is full of systems designed to manage risk, to optimize resources, to create a predictable and equitable future. They are built on data, on science, on the best intentions. But these systems are often brittle. They are designed for the average, for the expected. They have no room for the anomalous, the ancestral, the arcane. A regulation is a guess about the future written in the language of authority. A memory is a story of survival, written in the language of the land itself. What survives is not always what is most efficient. Sometimes, what survives is simply what is deepest. It is what has the patience to wait for the fickle, easy water to disappear, so it can remind everyone of the one inviolable truth. The sky has a long memory, and the wise man is the one who keeps a record of its ledger.